your host for this evening's discussion on the topic regard less of race. Much has happened in the last couple of months where incidents where members of the ethnic minority communities were adversely affected and in some cases clearly targeted and discriminated against, while in others, well, the jury is still out. Do these point to a surge in discrimination necessarily against members of the ethnic minority communities? Or is it that the incidents have been given prominence and impetus thanks to social media? I'm delighted that this has prompted deeper conversations on race. There have been several discussions in the past few weeks. Here are some highlights. On the 26th of June, Minister Lawrence Wong spoke at length at an IPS RSIS forum. He stressed the pioneering government efforts in having policies that safeguard minority interests. He cautioned about tribalism, hostility, and vengefulness, where we put the worst interpretation on every perceived slight or insensitivity, unquote. On the 9th of July, Senior Minister of State, Dr. Janil Puthuchery, and other panelists in a forum stressed the importance of not shying away from calling people out on racism. As we have benefited from lived experiences of minority communities being made known as a result of being called out. They are also cautioned against, on the other hand, weaponization of terms such as Chinese privilege. On the 14th of July, there was a Straits Times webinar where MCCY Minister Edwin Tong and other panelists also talked about being measured and reasonable when calling out. The minister said, quote, "I will not call the police each time the car comes 2 inches closer to my gate. Conversations and dialogue are better means." Just last Saturday, 24th of July, Home Affairs and Law Minister K. Shanmugam and SMS Siman spoke at a forum jointly organized by the government feedback agency REACH and Lianhe Chaopao. Commenting on Chinese privilege, MediaCorp actor Tay Peng Hui said that he grew up with what he termed a majority blind spot. Minister Shanmugam was also asked if there was the risk of retaliation by the majority Chinese community. Now, this evening, I suggest that we step back from the specific incidents and name calling and so on, and seek to gain a clearer perspective by asking some very foundational and inconvenient questions, if you may. Are we seeing heightened awareness, or is it oversensitivity? Is this long overdue payback time for Chinese privilege, or is that an unfair and insensitive hit against the majority community? What's the risk of the empire striking back? Why wouldn't the ethnic Chinese community say enough is enough? Then what? Is the situation really that bad? Are we going to come out of this weakened or stronger? Indeed, can we, as a people, regard less of race? Is this possible? To help us gain clarity and wisdom when dealing with the subject, we have a panel of 5 speakers, including me. Alvin Tan, Minister of State, Ministry of Trade and Industry, and Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth. Zainul Abidin Rashid, former Senior Minister of State and former President of MUIS, the Islamic Council, and also he was formerly CEO of Mendaki, which is the ethnic self-help group for the Malay community. He was also former editor of the Berita Harian, the Malay Daily. Fahima Nazat, social harmony advocate and founder and president of Hash.Peace. Last but certainly not least, Associate Professor Leong Chan Hung from the Center for Applied Research at Singapore University of Social Sciences, or SUSS. He's an expert on ethnic issues and national narratives. I'm also pleased to announce that we have 4 members of the National University Society, or NUSS, who have stepped forward to help me ask those inconvenient questions. Dr. N. Varaprasad, a seasoned educationist and member of the SINDA Board of Trustees. Ong Ai Gee, entrepreneur. Asman Jaafar, managing partner of a leading law firm. Soyida, NUSS Management Committee member. Before I invite my co-panelists to share their views, here's a short but powerful piece that I found in today's Straits Times. It's by William Tan, a reader of the Straits Times. It says, kindness, stranger, kept me dry in the rain. Recently, I was stuck in heavy rain, standing next to a stranger by the roadside. He turned to me and said that his wife was coming with an umbrella and that he would take me across. I thanked him and we waited. His wife arrived with one umbrella, so I told him to go ahead with her. He spoke to her, and the next thing I knew, she covered her head with a sari and started walking in the rain. He turned to me and said, please come. I asked him to go ahead with his wife, but he insisted on sheltering me. I thanked him and his wife when we got across. What a kind act. William Tan. Well, panelists, over to you. Please keep it to 30 minutes. You will have plenty of time later to add on to your comments. Here's the question I have for you. Is the situation really that bad? Are we going to come out of this weakened or stronger? Indeed, can we as a people regard less of race? Is this even possible? Zainul, why don't we start with you?
Oh, with me? Sure, Avisa. I don't know whether you agree with me or believe me when I say that I find the recent spate of events, as blessings. I've always been concerned, actually. For someone like me, a grandfather, I often wonder, how do the younger set of Singaporeans look at this topic about multiracialism, regardless of race, and whether they do understand the challenges that people like myself and my generation went through, the history, why we left Malaysia, what kind of institutions that we have, the government has instituted, turning to the constitution, government policies, and even policies related to the People's Association, for example. Do they really understand that? Or has the economic success, Singapore is a successful nation, a country, a nation, do the younger generation people take things for granted? Understanding history to me is a very important part of our understanding Singapore, understanding multiracialism. And I wish and I hope that the younger set of generation of Singaporeans, especially the millennials, do take history seriously, understand them, and then make whatever necessary changes, because society is evolving. The whole world is changing. We read about the challenges they face about race relations in the West, in our region, and it will continue to evolve and change. So I think history is important. Allow me, if I may, just to share with you my personal experience. I was almost killed in the 1964 riots. I was in secondary 4 then.
The race riots of 64.
Race riots, in 1964. I was in school and I had left school early because I had to go to Friday prayers, for being a Friday. And we didn't know that curfew had been called. I was on the way out from Bras Basaro Rifle Institution. We went to pay my friend's PUB bills at City Hall, and only to be told that riots have broken out, go back home. And I was almost caught near the Kallang Gaswork in those days, Lavender Street, and I was almost killed there. But that's not the end of the story. In the early 70s, I was involved in student activism, working with Malaysia, Indonesia, and there I found the experience of learning about what race and religion is about. Malaysia has its own prerogatives, Indonesia has its own Bhinneka Ikal Tunggal, unity in diversity, and Singapore, majority non-Muslims, Chinese in particular, and with minority Muslims. How do we cope? What kind of Muslims do you want to be? And when we work in the context of the region, I found the differences there. And in 1973, I was invited by President Gaddafi, Muammar Gaddafi, to attend an international youth conference.
President of Libya.
Libya, President Gaddafi of Libya. And we were told, we Muslims must unite against the rest of the world. They are all against us. We must unite. But I was very happy that the whole conference were united in saying, no, we want a more inclusive approach to this. We want to work with the rest of the world. We don't want to just stick on the Muslims working together against non-Muslims. And I came out of that conference very convinced. And after what happened in 1964, and in the context of working among the student leaders in the region of Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore, I came out more convinced that we must do all we can to make sure that our multiracial, multi-religious Singapore continue to succeed as a harmonious and united people. History is important. Understanding the contemporary world, especially how the millennials think, equally important, but to prepare us for the future about the evolving nature of our society, of the world, is also something that we must give due attention to.
Okay.
So those are the three areas I'd like to start off with, and I'll come back and share with you.
Thank you, Zainal. And so basically you're saying history, not just Singapore's history, but history internationally. You know, you need to know geopolitics, you need to know how certain things shaped in Singapore and around Singapore, right?
That's the reality.
Yeah. And Fahima, let me come to you next. What's to stop a younger generation person like you from saying, Zainal is telling old grandfather stories again, yet again, there he goes. You know, I mean, this thing, I'm sure Zainal has heard that from his real grandchildren, you know. So tell us, you're one of the youngest here.
Yeah, I see what you did there.
Yeah.
Okay, so okay, let me first just start with, is the situation worsening right now? No. If you remember 2016, the incident with Prima Delhi, where an employee, they made comments about his race. That was 2016. We're in 2021. Has the situation worse? Maybe not. But I think the angst is, why do we still have these situations? Why do we have that situation? I think that's the part where, my generation itself is angry. Are we sensitive about it? I think we should worry if we are not sensitive about it. If we had heard 1964, we had heard the history that Mr. Zainal said, and after all these years and all that education, discussion, and being a dialogical society, if we still see lecturers or all kind of incidents that kind of looks like the racism incident is continuing, how do you not be sensitive about it? Right? How do you not be sensitive about it? How does my generation take it and say, oh, this is just one of the incidents? We need to know that we are Singaporeans who grew up in Singapore that has shaped race, religion in a particular way. The expectations of race, religion, and not just about tolerating racism, but not even having racism is very high. That's the high expectation that my generation have. So with such high expectation, the accountability and the responsibility of how we react and respond and what the various stakeholders do comes very high. So I wouldn't say the situation is worsening or anything or sensitive, but I think we're looking at, is it matching up to our aspirations? And clearly there's a gap. And I think that's why the conversation has increased at a certain kind of a nature. Now,
what is the gap? What is this gap?
I don't know whether intergenerational gap of what is racism and how do you react or what you do with it is an issue, you see. For example, I always ask myself, let's say I was in that situation. Somebody looks, I'm clearly like, I'm like a nice token for somebody to just make a remark about my identity. Now, let's say if somebody did say something to me, what is the responsible Singaporean thing to do at that point of time? What is it? And I've heard various opinions. One is, the person is just insensitive, ignorant, and etc. So you should just tell them off and that's it. And then I've got my friends, you should just screenshot or you should just video and share it online. But I'm like, so what? How will it change this guy who was, or person who was insensitive to me? Is it going to change him? So I feel there is this gap of how we should deal with it. And that's why I feel that the discussion is going on now, but how it continues and where it lands is the curiosity that I have. Yeah.
Would you say that it's too simplistic to say that all boils down to intergenerational differences? because there are young people on a spectrum, right? Similarly, there are older people, also on a spectrum. I think, as William Blake, the poet, said, to generalize is to be an idiot, and there's a hell of a lot of generalizations going on. I mean, we keep saying young people are apathetic and so on. I'm honestly very tired of hearing that, because we meet young people all the time who are not. And the older people who are apathetic as well. So moving away from generalizations, could you share whether you, as a young person who speaks quite often, right, to audiences, have you had a strong pushback when you wanted to speak your mind on a sensitive issue like race or religion?
Yes. In fact, recently I have gone to a certain situation where I've self-regulated and self-cancelled my opinions, because I feel there was a point where discussion was going on defining racism, and I don't think I was brave enough to put myself out there and getting into that debate. It wasn't for me. I didn't think it was wise for me to get in there, because I didn't know what to say, despite the fact that I've talked to so many people. But I think for me, I took a very active decision to really focus on what emotions are being running down. Let's say with the minorities, what are the emotions that's going? I thought I should focus on that. And when we did the Living with Racism conversations recently at HPs, we just listened out to how people felt. And it's not just about, oh, I'm a minority and these are my advantages. When people go through microaggressions or racism, it affects self-confidence to a level. And I think I see these are the damages in the society. And sometimes some of the conversations go in a direction where I feel we're leaving out what we need to discuss, which will help us towards what's the help needed. Yeah.
Okay. I hope that you are a young person who represents the majority and not just a lone voice.
I hope so.
Because,
I hope so
because you may not like hearing this, but you make a lot of sense. Well, Chan Hong, over to you. I think it's about time that we have someone with numbers, statistics, studies, and so on. In August last year, you did a study, right, for SUSS, a study on housing and ethnicity.
Yes, that's right. Last year, I published a book and a book chapter rather, and I looked at housing clusterings of the different races. That study is actually a longitudinal study, and the data has been collected data since 2016, and I updated that data with the latest iteration in 2021. And what I found was, in spite of the EIP policies that we have, we still see.
No, but when you say EIP, you're talking about the ethnic integration policy.
That's right. That's right. So these are just some specific examples, where you still see a relative, whether you call it preference, voluntary or non-voluntary, housing arrangement where you see certain locations where have a greater concentration of the different races. So in central Singapore, for example, in Bishan, Toa Payoh area, you see a lot, and Queenstown, right, a lot more ethnic Chinese blocks have been affected by the ethnic Chinese quota, right, and they all concentrate, within certain numbers, right, in the neighborhood. And for ethnic Malay, you see a lot more in Marsiling area and Pasir Ris, and the Indians, and likewise for Indians, in various pockets of Singapore. So in spite of what the policies, I think you still see quite a fair bit of that. What I want to kind of allude to that, Viswa, is the fact that I think when we talk about race, the topic about your title of today's discussion, regardless of race, the irony is that I think over the last 50 years or so, right, race has still been a very important topic among Singaporeans, in spite of some of the policies that we have, to try to mitigate that. And I think when we talk about race, I think it's really, really important, right, to look at how the issue is being socially constructed. So not just looking at lived experience per se, but how it's being constructed within the minds of the different races, and looking understand the meaning of those policies and events. So if you look at, just take a very simple example, COVID-19, right? So for many of us, we say, oh, work from home, it's a fantastic idea, we have more work-life balance. But for many Singaporeans, or at least for some Singaporeans, it's actually an isolation, right? 452 people took their own lives whole of last year, right? And a big part of the reason is because they feel cut off. So I think you really have to understand that from the perspective of the people who are affected. And that brings me to the second point, which is, some of these policies, whether intentionally or unintentionally, that resulted in a lot of comparison, a lot of angst, and a lot of dissatisfaction. One of which, going back to EIP again, right? So if you are a minority but you happen to reside in a Chinese concentrated neighborhood, right? When you want to sell your flat, you may find yourself restricted because you can only sell it to other ethnic minorities, all right? And very often they may not be able to pay, with a higher cash over valuation, and as a result, your neighbor flat, the Chinese seller may be selling the flat for 500,000, but for you, because you're a minority, you have to sell the flat at 450,000. So that whole dimension kind of brings, or rather, it brings in a different dimension, and that's one of which of a relative deprivation, of being deprived as a result of your background. So I think
would you say, Chan Hong, would you say that what we are talking about here is, even though a policy may be introduced for very good reasons, like EIP, right, ethnic integration policy, it is to make sure that there's a reasonable distribution of people of ethnicities across the country and not have enclaves, ethnic enclaves. I mean, it's a very reasonable, good policy, but there are externalities, there are negative consequences of that policy, unintended, perhaps, which we need to start addressing, because you can't sweep them under the mat, because over time they become viewed as discrimination, even though the intention is not to discriminate, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, their policies well, the considerations may be strong. There are policies in the armed forces, right, that could be viewed as discriminatory as well, even though there may be larger strategic intentions behind those policies. What about SAP schools, right? Special assistance schools. I mean, a lot of this issue has come up in various conversations lately. Even the creation of Sinda, Mendaki, and so on, ethnic self-help groups. Are we moving away from a Singapore concept? So there are plenty of policies, but it's very clear that these policies, when they were introduced, had very good intent. But there are consequences that are unexpected, unforeseen, but still the government needs to address these unintended outcomes. What's your comment on that?
I don't think people are against, Singaporeans are against EIP or, some of the programs that we have put in place, including the self-help groups, delineated along racial lines. I think the direction now, or the goal is really more of a reconciliation. How can we make it better? How can we, revisit some of those policies that we have to ensure that no one is being discriminated, ironically, as a result of those policies. So I think it's in that perspective that I think it's important we try to understand how those policies are constructed within the minds of the people who are affected, and what are the the unintended inequality that result as a rising of those policies,
or even perceived discrimination, not just inequality.
So if I may come in,
yes,
many of the examples you mentioned, whether it's housing, whether it's SAP school, or whether it's national service, and many other examples, they're not static in the sense that they have been evolving, there have been adjustment, there have been reconsideration, but I don't know whether there is a perfect solution to all this. So, but we must understand that in fact it is evolving, but nonetheless, I agree with you, we must continue to assess them and see whatever other changes that may be necessary.
So the policies are evolving, people are evolving too.
Yes.
What may have been acceptable to a cohort of people in 1965 may not be acceptable to a similar cohort of people in today.
That's right. So
they're just, so we cannot run away from contextualizing the explanations, and expecting that what may have been accepted sometime back is being rejected now, and we need to put in the effort to explain it. That's what we're talking about. Maybe this is a good time to go to the Minister. Minister, would you want to respond very quickly to this comment before moving on to anything else that you may want to say?
Thank you, Vishwa, and thank you to my fellow panelists. I think you've gone through the whole gamut, through to Jig Zainul, to Fahima, and then to Chan Hong. If you don't mind, I'll just take a step back a little bit, because I think when Jig Zainul shared about his story in 1964, it really sent something running down the back of my head. truth be told, I mean, I'm not as young as Fahima. I didn't grow up in the 60s. I didn't grow up in the 70s. I was born in the 80s and then grew up in the 80s and 90s. So I don't have an appreciation that the lived experience of Njik And I want to put it out there because as you know, Njik was in government. You and Njik have put in place a lot of the different policies in your time. The baton has been passed to my generation of leaders, which do not have the experiences of your generation of leaders. But we would be amiss and remiss if we didn't understand the context of history, and we would be too quick to then remove or too quick to tweak too much some of the policies that they have been in place because we don't have a deeper understanding. Now, my grandfather's stories have been with actually typically my grandma Nene, who is because she's Peranakan, and she told me all of these stories, but I don't have that visceral feel. So then whether somebody now born in the 80s, closer to maybe Fahima's vintage, but you know, what kind of policies do you want to put in place? I just came back. I'm actually here in a hotel room because I'm serving my SHN. I spent about a week or so in Italy for the G20 Energy Ministerial, and I met with many different ministerial delegations there. And I sat next to the South African delegation. I spoke to the Japanese, and earlier on I had a meeting with a French person. And they all shared with me their different experiences with race and religion. We didn't really talk about climate change, of course, that's very important, but we talked about race and religion. And at the core of it, if we take a step back, a lot of these things are still happening in many different countries. I'll just share one quick story and then we go into some of the details. But if you know the French youth minister, so quite similar portfolio to myself, Sarah El Hairi. She met with a group of youth, and I look after youth for the Ministry of Community Youth and Culture, Community and Youth. So we always have these dialogues with youth. But she had a dialogue with youth, and she talked about the French Republican values. And of course, you thought that the youth would just say, sure, you know, regardless of whether I'm Algerian or Caucasian, European, French, we're all Republican French. But the youth actually pushed back towards her because she was espousing Republican values, while the youth say, no, you need to recognize my identity. You need to recognize my specific history, my ethnicity, my culture, and so on and so forth. So that taught me something. The second quick example is Naomi Osaka, who was just out of the Olympics. And Japan is not as homogeneous as we think it is. And I spoke to the Japanese environment minister. There was an issue with regards to Naomi Osaka where Nissin tried to color her face a little bit lighter. Nissin, and they pulled it back. Because of course her father was from Haiti, her mother is Japanese. So a lot of these, and I can share a lot of different examples later on, but it taught me that, ultimately, we cannot just erase. It is not about regardless of race, but it's about understanding that every single one of us have our unique culture, identity, history. And we must make sure that, we continue to recognize that, honor that, respect that. So coming back then to Chan Hong's point about EIP, we've had that debate in Parliament. I think time has flown. I don't know, earlier this week, last week. Last week. Okay. I think for EIP, just one question before I sign off. What if we did not have EIP? I spent a lot of time in the US West Coast, and I remember I was in the tech companies, and I remember Menlo Park. Palo Alto. There's East Palo Alto and Palo Alto. You separated by a highway. This side all white, this side all African American. And my colleagues said, don't go to the other side. Why? So I'm not sure. I hope that we don't need to find out if there is a counterfactual where we don't have EIP or even GRC and others, which is very controversial, which offends some of the youth in our time. But then going back into history again, to Mr. Zainal's point, what if the youth of our era, at our time, were transported back? Would they then say, I wish you had put these in place? So that's all I have.
Yeah.
Thank you, Vishwa.
So thank you. But Minister, I think the point that's being made is not that people today are questioning the policy itself.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't think most people who are sensible would question the policy, but there are consequences in spite of all the good things that policy is meant to do. What are we doing to mitigate those? That's the question. Because if you leave it unmitigated for too long, then no matter how well-intentioned the policy is, people will only see how it affects me. You know, I mean, I've come across a lot of people who are ethnic minority who are very, very upset that they've lost out in the sale of their flat. First of all, it's very difficult. Secondly, they've lost out in terms of, you know, and if this lingers and if it's not addressed in some form, it can actually come back to bite us. So I think the point here is not so much what if we didn't have the policy. I think people accept that we do need some of these policies, but from time to time, and perhaps with increasing frequency, we need to explain these policies in the new context as well. You know, for example, if you talk about the you know, what people view as some form of discrimination against the Malay or Muslims in the Singapore Armed Forces, you know, all three prime ministers have openly talked about this. You know, but you see, the context about accepting it has actually changed very much since 1965, because the circumstances under which we were unceremoniously thrown out of Malaysia, you know, made us understand the context a little bit more at that time, right? Because there was a lot of mistrust. But today, after 55 years of independence, you know, people are asking, are we still doubting each other? Are we still talking about the machine gunnist in Kota Tinggi? And these are valid questions. And I think the point we're making is, number one, I think government, there are no shortcuts. Government needs to continue to explain in today's context. Number two, going back to what Zainal said, you know, I think we need to teach history a lot better. I mean, I honestly, if I can be blunt, I think history is taught in an awfully bad way. There is no room for imagination. There's no room for storytelling. It's all about memorizing dates and so on. I mean, you talk to 8 out of 10 people who studied history in the Singapore school system say, I hate it. But as a nation that doesn't understand, doesn't appreciate its own history, I think will pay a price. And I think we are beginning to pay a price for it. So I would like a quick comment from you about whether we need to start emphasizing history again.
Vishwa, there's a new generation, and I wear my tech hat now. This new generation has a attention span of 3 seconds. Let me share a little bit. You know, when I was working at Facebook and Instagram some years ago, and you know, and Fahima, we talked about this before, right? You know, there's this thing called thumb stopping content. The content must be able to make your thumb stop, you know. That means it has to grab your attention within 3 seconds before it hits you and before you consume the content. So, and that is because we are now in a supercharged world where obviously, you know, we have smartphones and the rise of more different internet social media platforms. It used to be Facebook, Instagram, now TikTok is even shorter. That is the truth of it. And so you have to, at least for the younger generation, be able to communicate in a way in the medium that they are comfortable with. Now, there are also others which are more long form, like YouTube, which this is being streamed in, but you cannot have it in the old way. Actually, a lot of people are now learning online. You can learn an entire course online, but you need to be able to be a content creator in that regard. So I agree with you, history, but how you frame it is important.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I'm sure all of us here agree that we
come
need
in,
to frame
Vishwa?
it differently. Yes, yes, I know.
I come just to correct if there's impression that I was more talking about just history, but I am talking about history as how things happen. But I think more, if not equally important, is how it has evolved. For example, if you look, even if you look at how the indigenous position of the Malays were enshrined in the constitution and they were given free education, right? But even that has been changed, has evolved in the sense that we live in a one man, one vote system, policy democracy, and the government also had pressures from Chinese who are there. There are a lot more Chinese in terms of absolute numbers who may even be poorer than Malays, in terms of absolute numbers. And there were real pressures. And in fact, there was a policy change where it's no longer automatic for Malays to get free education after university, but they have to go for a means test.
Yeah.
And that upset the Malays because it was a constitutional position. But even not only the majority Chinese, but even the Malays must understand the realities of our society, the democracy we live in, the kind of situation. And I think, for example, people are saying, why should the son of MPs get free school fees too, when there are a lot more Chinese and Indians who are poor who are not getting? So how the policies has evolved, how the policies have changed, I think require that understanding too. That's one example. Even the ethnic integration policy, it was meant basically, the Malays were very comfortable in living together, like they were creating new Gelangs, right?
I understand.
But when the Indians were affected too, they were in fact facing the problem even more acute than the Malays because their numbers are smaller in terms of resale value. So there are practical difficulties. There were changes and there were remedial actions taken, but as I mentioned earlier, I agree with you. It needs continue to be looked at and make changes where necessary.
Right. So I'm the fifth panelist, so I also have the right to say to give my piece. I just have one point to make, which is this, right? I don't buy the idea that it's all right for minority communities, members of minority communities, to feel aggrieved and assume that the majority community has no right to feel aggrieved because you're majority. Unfortunately, I've been hearing this a lot more recently, that they should not be feeling aggrieved because they're majority, 75%. But I don't buy it. Racism, discrimination according to race, it's wrong no matter what. It doesn't mean, and we should never allow a situation where it is all right for a minority member to do it because we are small and we are vulnerable. I think we need to move away from that because we can't be a society. We should be able to call out racism regardless of who the perpetrator is and who the victim is. Wrong is wrong. That's for me a fundamental issue. And I'm very deeply concerned because I'm hearing it from more and more minority members of minority ethnic communities who are saying, no, and it's almost like this, right? My daughter was chairing a forum when she was studying in the UK, on Black Lives Matter, Now, she decided to say that, there are others who are also being discriminated, including Indians and others. But she got slammed because they said the talk was, no, Black Lives Matter more. Now, I think if we go that path, it's going to be a dangerous and very slippery slope because we can't say, no, Malay lives matter more. No, Indian lives matter more. I can't buy it. And I'm deeply troubled by it. And I would love to hear the views of, not now necessarily, but the views of the panelists and the others here on this, Now, with that, I'd like to throw it open to our representatives from NUSS. Anyone wants to go first? Prasad, shall we go with you first?
Okay, thank you, Vishwa. First of all, you introduced me as trustee of SINDA. So I just want to clarify that I'm not here representing SINDA. but as a member of NUSS. Okay, and not even as an Indian, but more as a Singaporean.
Sure.
So I think I just want to clarify that. I'm also of Zainal's vintage. In fact, we are from the same cohort in school. So I'm also quite familiar with the issues of the 63, 64 racial riots, which we all experienced at the age of 16.
You were born in Myanmar, weren't you?
I was born in Myanmar, but I came here at a very, very young age. It's a pure accident of history, you might say, because there were quite a large number of Indians living in Myanmar or Burma at that time.
Yeah.
But it just happened that during the war, my father decided to go into the Burmese jungles. So that's a different story altogether.
You are younger than me, Prasad.
No, we are the same age. We are the same age. Don't try to abang me here. But I do feel that the panelists have been speaking in generalities, in broad policy terms. But I think what people want to know is what concrete steps can be taken to reduce or remove covert and overt racism in the public space. For example, I have seen personally a taxi driver who bypasses a Malay auntie and then stops for a Chinese auntie. I have seen personally a Chinese auntie who avoids sitting next to an Indian. And of course, the most blatant of all that we see is in the housing market, where landlords and their agents are very blatant in asking information on race, nationality, and even work pass status. You can see this on the apps and on the website. They ask you to fill your race, they ask you to fill your nationality. And this is even applied to professionals such as doctors, engineers, and scientists. And I think what people want to know is what can be done to remedy the situation? What can be done to improve the situation? You know, in my youth, and I'm sure with Zainal also, we used to play with all races freely and without malice. All the way into the night, we used to go into each other's houses. And reading Kishore Mahbubani's piece yesterday, it reminded me of my own childhood. How can we recreate this environment today in schools and housing estates? Because what I see in the white decks are racially homogeneous groups at play. Indians, Malays, and Chinese, and not as much getting together as during what I think is my time. So one of the things is, do you think that, and this Vishwa, you asked this question earlier, is it because of social media that we are seeing an explosion of this issue up front, or is it that it has already existed but we never knew about it? So I just want to throw some of these observations into the pool.
Thank you, Prasad. If I may just chime in on that. One of the things that has disturbed me is soccer, right? And this comes under MCCY. So, Minister Alvin Tan, you should be able to comment on this as well. You see, I was told that some of the top schools in Singapore, like Raffles Institution, St. Joseph's, these were the top soccer schools when I was in school, right? They've stopped soccer. They had stopped soccer. I don't know whether they reinstated. They had stopped soccer for a long time. And the reason I was told by someone quite authoritative, and one of the reasons was you don't have enough Malay boys. I mean, this is deep, it's not racism per se, but it's deep racial stereotypes, which are the foundations of racism, you know. And as a result, if you look, I mean, this sort of thinking, if you look at the national team, it's almost 100% Malay. And then it begs, one starts assuming that Malays are designed specially to be able to play soccer. But that's not the case. I mean, when I was in school, most of the soccer team comprised Chinese and some Indians and some Malay. So you see, you start creating stereotypes when you start assuming that certain races are better. And then I've also heard that because of a certain affinity for a particular race, you start branding that particular sport as a rowdy sport. I'm being very blunt about these things, but these things needs to be tackled. We need to try and find out why certain schools are not having it.
But Vishwa, just to add to your concern, it's a lot more complex than that. It's not just about soccer. I was on the board of Raffles Institution, and we were facing the same problems. We feel that not enough Malays were coming to RI, and there was less intermingling between the races. And we even went out to try identify potential Malay students at primary 5 to give them bursaries so that we can encourage them to go to RI. But now the new Malays, they also do not want to go to RI. They have to depend on bursaries, and they feel inferior because RI has become an independent school,
yeah,
where the fees are a lot higher and they have to depend on bursaries, and they feel a lot smaller. They would rather stay in a neighborhood school, top the neighborhood school, rather than come in. So depriving RI, for example, of the Malay students, which are important, like in the early days. So they're a lot more complex.
No, it's obviously is layered, but I just want to chime in with that as well. I mean, there are various issues, and all these things can over time result in entrenched stereotypes.
Yeah, Vishwa, can I also just add that RI, I suspect, and SJI too, probably dropped soccer because it's not a game they were winning in.
They were winning, and the reason given, I'm sorry, and the reason given is we don't have enough Malay boys. The other schools who were winning had Malay boys. So again, without belaboring the point, I just wanted to say that this is an issue.
Just to the fact that, and you say the person is of a certain authority, has put a racial lens to it is the problem we're having.
Yeah.
There could have been multiple reasons or, various factors which have contributed to it. Yet the racial lens was because there was always that stereotyping. And when people in certain capacities do it, it goes against the very idea of what I was brought up with, regardless of race. Yeah. This is where we clearly saw that it is not regardless of race. And you see, and I want to go back to the whole thing about, yes, we want to know the reasons and the history of, why policies came. I need to clarify on behalf of my generation or my age group people, the part where we want to avoid ethnic clustering, that we get. That needs no explanation, because that's quite, any human being with moral values would want to avoid that. Now, the problem is EIP the only way at the cost of what, of ethnic clustering? And the thing that recently when we were talking about this, and I was reading what Professor Chan Hong was doing, apparently Tampines, where I live, there's more Malays, and apparently it does actually potentially, form a cluster. So clearly EIP itself, it's not, solving the problem that was created for certain areas.
Yeah.
So then the question, I think, is not so much of trying for the government to sort of keep explaining why the policy came, is what direction do we need to know to get some of these policies to sort of adjust to the aspirations. Now, this requires consultations with people who are going to go into that future of, into the younger generations going. So I think, instead of explaining, we have not moved even towards the consultations of what other options are out there. Do these options work? Have they been considered before when the EIP came about? I don't think I've ever heard, apart from EIP, what other solutions were considered to solve ethnic clustering, you see. So I feel that is lacking, yeah.
All right, okay. So could we hear from the other NUSS representatives, and then we can have a response from, I don't think it's fair for us to expect the minister to respond on behalf of the government on all this. So as long as we have the understanding that these issues are raised, and I'll leave it to the minister and anybody else who wants to respond to these things. It doesn't have to be the minister responding to all those questions.
Can I come in here? Yes.
Yeah, yes.
I was just thinking about this. I think what's really curious is the fact that having understood how government has behaved all along from 1965 to now, I think suddenly you realize that there's got to be a whole new level of social engineering that's got to take place to take into consideration what we used to think we could live with, but we increasingly find that we can't live with anymore. And I must say that I'm usually quite confused when it comes to racism, because I sometimes get it from both sides. I mean, I get discriminated by Malays thinking I'm Chinese, and then sometimes I get discriminated by Chinese thinking I'm Malay. So, but that's quite interesting because it gives me an understanding of both lenses, if you like. I've always thought that one thing that's interesting about racism as we understand it is the fact that, I had an interesting conversation with a colleague just now. I said, what hits you first when you think about racism? And the first thing he said is, well, he related to me an incident, and then he was talking about how he would prefer to be race blind, but there's a problem with it. Even if you don't have in your IC, right, a portion for race, right, you will find that by just reading out the name, you would know whether this person is Malay, Indian, Chinese, or for that matter, a Eurasian, and so on. And that would actually mean that at the end of the day, we're not like Indonesia. You could be Ahmad Widodo, but you're Christian, right? And you're from another part of Indonesia. In Singapore, it's not. If your name is Viswa, you're Indian. If your name is Azman, you're Malay. So we can't quite get out of this. We are all rooted in our ethnic backgrounds. And at the end of the day, it's just quite clear to me that what we will have to do is something that's going to be long drawn. It's a work in progress all the time. And if you remember, someone mentioned about what the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew once said, that what he wanted to see was integration within Singapore. Singapore is not about whether it's Chinese or it's Malay. Being Singaporean means requires a lot of integration, a lot of mutual respect, a lot of understanding between the different ethnic groups. And that would mean that in the long term, we need to have enough going on within our social circles as well as in government, processes that will encourage this. Because as it stands right now, I think Fahima mentioned just now about not knowing how we should behave. Should we have said this? Should we have said that? For me, I find racial incidents very disturbing because I actually tend to remember them. I remember them too vividly. When it happens to me, I would go through this process of thinking through again and again and again as to whether I did the right thing by saying something or not saying something. Maybe we should be taught about how to deal with this, because I sometimes really don't know. Should I have called out? Did I call out correctly? Did I do too much? Should I have just confronted the person, and so on?
I mean, if I could respond to that, right, very quickly, about calling out, how do you respond, right? I've been in committees where I'm probably one of two minority members, right? The rest are ethnic Chinese, right? But all English-speaking ethnic Chinese. And then suddenly the conversation breaks into Mandarin. I am seated there, but what I do, and this has always worked. What I do is I put up my hand and say, I'm sorry, do you mind speaking English, please? I call it out immediately, but not with anger. I don't bang the table. I just, very matter of fact, immediately I say, can you speak English, please? And there's not been a single occasion where they've not apologized. It always comes with an apology. I'm so sorry, and they will go into English, right? So I mean, the approach I take is I don't grit my teeth and bear with it and then go back and smash the wall. I say it then and there, and it works. So sometimes it's about giving the benefit of doubt to the individuals. Sometimes it's about ignorance. I don't know.
And I'm sure a lot of the time there's no malice intended.
Yeah, I believe so, but where there is clear malice intended, I think we should call it out and call it out loud.
Yeah. And sometimes my problem is if you start speaking in Mandarin, I'll just join in and just continue, because I did Mandarin in school.
And you wonder why people are confused whether you're Chinese.
Yeah. So, but in the end, I think
this is why I say the whole recent phenomena, I call it a blessing, because it's a real opportunity for us to have a better understanding. And I hope more of those views, what Azman expressed, I think we should share and we should discuss, because I find sometimes the reaction from different ethnic groups also complicate matters. So I think better understanding will bring about that better harmony, I feel, for going forward.
Right. Yida? You have anything to say, Yida or Aigi?
Yeah, I think I'll just make 2 points. Just now, I think you mentioned, there's wrestling of this SAP schools, and perhaps I'll share my own experience. I myself, I spent 12 years in SAP schools, from primary school all the way to junior college. I think I want to take this opportunity to clarify, that there's actually a lot of effort being taken. So, I mean, I studied in Chinese High when I was in secondary school. And I think not known to many, all of us, we spent our first 2 years also studying Malay. So, there was the conscious effort, to, bridge across races. And there were active efforts by students ourselves to organize interactions, engagements with madrasas, and all the different schools out there. So I think there's a lot of proactive outreach on the ground, some organized by the school, some that were, initiated by the students ourselves. I mean, coming from this background, we know that, we don't have many opportunities to interact with people from different races. We proactively create these opportunities to do so. And I think, NS have been a great opportunity, a great mixer where I get to meet a lot of friends from non-Chinese backgrounds. Similarly in education institutions, in the universities, and out there in community work.
What about women, girls who go through SAP schools? They don't have NS.
So I think that it's whether one proactively reaches out to create those opportunities. I think just now you ask about what the government can do and all that, but I think the onus is on ourselves to create the opportunity to proactively go out there to bridge the gap. Whenever there's Hari Raya open houses or Deepavali or Diwali open houses by my friends, I always make it an attempt to visit and attend and to catch up with my friends. And I think there are many of all these opportunities. It's whether we take time to make time for these. The second point I want to mention is just now we talked about racial stereotypes, and I just wanted to ask, I'm sure many of us have attended Kumar, the comedian, stand-up comedian. He makes a lot of racist jokes, using racial stereotypes and all that. Many Singaporeans attend, they laugh along. Does laughing along constitute being racist? What is acceptable? I think some government agencies also engage Kumar, to engage the people. I'm not sure whether these are the right things. So where do we draw the line? Why is Kumar given that license, the liberty to make such jokes, whereas when it comes to other other actors, actresses, or other commoner out there, then it becomes racism. So where do we draw the line?
It's an interesting point, Yida. I mean, because what comes to my mind is the brown face incident, right? That happened a couple of years back. The comedian, MediaCorp comedian, who's Chinese, who did this ad, and which was commissioned, and he dressed up in 4 different ethnicities, and then a lot of members of the minority communities felt that they were being caricatured, and they took offense, this question, it raises this question, right? I mean, when is a joke all right, and when does it become offensive?
Yeah, Wiswa, you don't mind if I just step in and say my 2 cents about SAP schools, because it's a very hot topic every time it comes up.
Yes.
But before that, let me say that Kumar banks every race. He's very even-handed in his coverage. But nevertheless, I know that government has explained the SAP schools policy many times, but I think there's no justification for SAP schools at the primary level. That's my view. I think at the primary level, you should be allowed to mix freely with, and that's when you learn about other races. That's when you get exposed.
Where the curiosity is high.
12 years of, and to just follow up on Yida's point about having to proactively organize this and that, I think it's not necessary. That's not the way to say, okay, we have a SAP school, so let's go and do this. Let's go and visit a madrasa. I mean, it needn't be that way.
Yeah.
But coming back, I think that primary school should be free, should not be any SAP schools, no ethnic discrimination.
Yeah.
And then secondary school, yeah, you can do your cultural inculturation and higher mother tongue and all of that.
Yeah. You are an educationist, and
Yes.
You've been an educationist almost all your life. And would you say that that's been your observation? The formative years are very, very critical.
Absolutely, and that's how it was for me.
Yeah. Minister, maybe this is a good time. No, I'll give you a bit more time. Let's go to the psychologist, the expert. Any studies to show this, to substantiate what the observation by Prasad, Varaprasad?
Well, Viswa, I want to go back to the earlier point about the segregation point that you make, because I think that's also related to the point about from Prasad about having SAP school at a later age. And the earlier point was, why do we feel so much more segregation today as opposed to, say, 50 years ago? How I feel is that, while we have made it very clear that racism, there's no place for racism in modern Singapore, we have made other forms of discrimination, we have legitimized other forms of discrimination, right? And one of which is materialism, right? Basically, it's okay to be competitive. It's okay to go out, and make as much money as you can, so long as you follow within the framework. So if you look at EIP as one example, I did a bit of sharing on Sunday, and it was in the social media, and I was quite shocked, to see that people actually think it's perfectly all right, for minority races to be getting $50,000 less, than the market resale price, because that's how the market works, right? And I think what happens is people tend to forget that they are pursuing material wealth, pursuing success, and you legitimize that at the expense of the racial, so that whole racial and class lens kind of overlap. And I think that's what happens when you talk about stereotypes, when you talk about looking at other people, and immediately you form certain impression, because class and race have actually overlapped a lot more today, compared to, say, maybe 50 years ago. Because in the past, I think there's a lot more opportunities for people to move ahead, so there's mobility, there's opportunities in spite of that.
Yeah. But do you have any studies that show that young people in primary school, for example, if they don't get enough of an exposure to a multiracial setting, they lose out?
Definitely. If you look at race, if you look at how young toddlers, in fact, they form certain impression about other races at a very early ages. So, if they do not have the opportunity to socialize, to mix around, they take their impression, from the parents, from the neighboring environment, and that reinforces, how they feel about other races as they grow up. So that impression can only deepen, as the years goes by. So having that exposure at a very young age is actually important for them to have an understanding of their actual environment.
Okay, got it. Minister.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Minister, I just want to add.
Go ahead, Fahima. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry. So I think we cannot be looking at SAP schools or even EIP as, like individual issues. See, as a minority, you have to look at, I have a collective, firstly, my identity. I'm, like you said, I'm in a room, people suddenly code switch into a language I don't know, I'm almost invisible, add that onto me. And then suddenly my visible identity there, then add that onto me. And then there is ethnic, the EIP that has financial, a disadvantage, it might cross to me, and then adds on as well. And then while we are already grappling with this, and when I'm told that EIP is to avoid ethnic clustering, but we are okay with schools where there is a sort of a clustering that happens because it represents a certain race, right? So you have to look at all this collectively, these issues. When I, as a minority, look at it, then it looks like, wow, there's so many factors that contributes to, bias or prejudice or any kind of stereotyping. I think that's where, as a minority, we come in. It's the collective amount of factors. Yeah.
Okay. Minister, you were going to say something just now.
Thanks, Vishwa. And I just want to thank the panelists also for just sharing. I mean, I've done about 8 of these sessions, Vishwa, and most of the time, either myself or my colleagues. Actually, there's one that's run parallel at this time, 7:30 or so. I think Janelle is doing it now. Most of the time, the government representative speaks the most. I found it the most unhelpful if we were to speak and to pontificate and to share and to defend. I think it is more helpful if we listened.
Yeah.
And I've been taking a lot of notes. You look at my iPad, it's full of notes. Maybe I can just share a little bit on all of this. Number one is, I think as Min Lawrence had mentioned earlier on, and I truly feel this, is it's the majority has to know that it's not easy being the minority. The majority has to know that it's not easy being the minority. And Vishwa, when you shared about that incident of yours, it's very common. It's very common. In fact, in one government meeting I just had earlier today, same thing happened. Same thing happened. And I felt uncomfortable too, believe it or not.
Yeah.
I don't know, because I feel a little bit more sensitive to these things. Maybe having been exposed in more of the, having worked in the Western private sector for some time. But I do feel that, hey, we ought not to be speaking in a language which somebody else doesn't understand. I think that's quite critical. That's one. The second is with regards to, so let me just frame it in this way. There are certain ways, right? The first one is, we talked about at the start, that we cannot look at everything as monolithic. Let me just share one of the discussions that I had in one of the 8 dialogues that I had. And Fahima, we're going to have another dialogue in the next week as well, right? So Vishwa, we really non-stop, you know. One of this Chinese gentleman, I think in his 60s, said, you know, we should just, he cited Branson and Bezos's spaceship. So just to paint it. So, you know, they went up and then they saw the Earth, you know, and I think that the Earth should be in monolithic, basically, you know, nobody has a care about different race and religion. And then I said, you know, that would be something that we all are potentially hope for. But if you zoom down and you come back down to Earth, there are differentiators. There are differentiators. And we can do 2 things. One is we can say we can ignore that, which is what the French are doing. Or we can accentuate it, which is what, Fisher, we talked about this before, about South Africa, which is what the Dutch with apartheid, which means apartness, apart from segregated people systematically. I think Singapore has a very unique position where we don't want to go, I think, either or. But what we want to do is to recognize. I think a lot of the recognize the different faiths, the different religions. And I'm speaking not as a new government official, you know, because I'm quite new to this, but I speak as a practitioner on the ground. Fahima knows this. I mean, before joining government and I was in the private sector, I spent a lot of time in the community with the IRCCs. In fact, I chaired one of the IRCCs. I was one of the youngest IRCC chairs. So brought in a lot of crazy ideas. How to mix. One of the things that I found about the IRCCs, for example, is that there was not a lot of diversity. I mean, if I were to be frank, it's all men in their 40s, 50s, 60s. Where are the youth? Where are the women? Where are the youth and where are the women? How can we have more ideas on how to mix if we only have, you know, men in their 40s, 50s, and 60s? So what we then did on the ground is that we said, okay, no, we need to force it a little bit, you know, and we need to take the lead. So my RCC changed a lot more in terms of their makeup. Even in government where I learned something, and it's not just, I'm providing this example, which is quite important, is because, Zainul, you were in government for a while, when the staff gave me this list of a committee, and I looked at it, and I said, cannot lah. And I said, why? I said, not enough. Why is it all Chinese males, or majority Chinese males? Where are the women? Where are the ethnic people from other ethnicities? They came back to me, still not good enough. Send it back a couple of times. The point is this, that we can have the best policies in place. And of course, the policies are not the best. They are subject to tweaks, just as what Min Desmond mentioned, that EIPs, you know, we're tweaking it, but also there are exceptions to it if you appeal. But it also requires people in leadership positions to make the call and to set the culture right. And so then we went a few times, no revision, and it came back more diversity in ethnicity, more diversity in gender. But it was still not good enough for me, but I knew that they were doing their best already. But it is a step. So what I'm trying to do and what we're trying, Gizana, hopefully we do you proud, is that our generation of leaders, be it in the corporate world, in the government world, non-profit, which social sector world, which is what Fahima represents, and I used to be a big part of, is that we need to set the standard. It cannot always depend on government to do it. We cannot always depend on what the policies are, but we can change a lot of the culture. And with the change in some of the culture, then you can move some of these threats and change some of the policies. And that's why I always talked about the youth, because I spend a lot of time with the youth as deputy chair of NYC, and they are the ones that are also giving us some clues as to what they're thinking of and what they aspire to be.
Yeah. So, Minister, since you talk about youth, I'd like to bring the question that was raised by Varaprasad.
Yes.
Do we want SAP schools to start from primary schools? I think it's a worthy question. We'd be interested to hear your thoughts about it, not necessarily representing the government because it's a sensitive subject, but we'd like to hear your thoughts about it, because the general view is that, yeah, SAP schools are necessary. There's an intention, but why start in primary school? Why not start secondary? In fact, quite a few SAP school students actually start from secondary, and they end up having the proficiency in both Mandarin and English by the time they finish JC. So what's your take on that?
Why did we have SAP schools in the first place?
No. Why do we need starting in primary school?
Yeah, but I'm sure many of us know, but why we had SAP schools in the first place? And it confers a lot of that. Number one, if you were in business or you were in the corporate world, the lingua franca is obviously English. But we also know that a large part of the market right now is also, or has been, in Mandarin as well, with the Chinese market. That's one. But I wonder whether, to Mr. Prasad, you mentioned earlier on whether we wanted to make it so that, ITA, for example, goes into a SAP school in secondary only. I think there are many different thoughts into this. Let me try. It's a very difficult subject, Vishwa.
Yeah.
Number one is whether, and I think studies have shown, and Prof. Leong, please keep me on the straight here, whether it is easy also to be bilingual. And I think Mr. Lee Kuan Yew had suggested in his lifetime it's very difficult to be bilingual. He thought that it could be bilingual, but it's not so easy. So I wondered whether starting them younger confers some form of ability to be bilingual. I don't know. I think, Prof, if you have more information on that or more studies, please let us know. I think I'm not adverse to the fact that if you can mix more in primary school, in fact, I think, if I'm not wrong, my MOE colleagues tell me that by 2021, I think they're going to have Malay language classes or third language classes in the SAP schools as well. So I think there are a few changes within the SAP, the SAP school curriculum, that's going to be to change. I think ultimately you have to really just balance between whether, number one, the proficiency in being bilingual versus the others. But ultimately, you will need to also have all of these different aspects in community, because I think it was Prof. Leong who mentioned that it also depends upon what you see, do, hear, feel at home and in the community.
Yeah, but the problem is sometimes the experience at home could be negative.
It is. And
therefore, it needs to be compensated by having something different, a positive experience in school. I think the point is made that we hope that the government would seriously consider, especially given all the warning signs recently, that we can't take this dimension lightly when we're coming up with public policy. The policy cannot be unidimensional in the intent. We have to look at the externalities as a result, the consequences as a result. You know, could we quickly go to Aigi at this point in time?
Okay, thank you, Kiswa.
Yeah.
I'm clearly the minority here, given that like I'm the only one of the two females in this panel.
And you're Chinese. And you're Chinese, you're a minority today.
And also possibly the minority in terms of the generation. I don't belong to the Gen Y, which and also the Boomer generation. I actually belong to the silent generation, meaning from the Gen X. So I hope to see that I can be of a bridge in this session, because I feel that like I have to be very practical. What I've heard is that racism has manifested in many forms, like casual racism, microaggressions, unconscious biasness, to very, systematic racism. So to me, I feel that like, if we want to tackle this issue, we have to be very practical, like what can we tackle, right? So how are we going to influence policies versus the hawker uncle selling you type of, right? So I think we have to be very realistic. We can't expect the government to do everything. And of course, so I feel that the microaggressions and the so-called unconscious biasness is, I think it's a work in progress, and it would be really helpful if the next generation don't get too outraged about it. I think we should have a platform where we can have a careful discussion, a calm discussion, and be able to, like Viswas point out, like, hey, you know, I'm not speaking, I don't speak Chinese when I'm in a meeting with other people. It actually is helpful, because I believe speaking as like a non-minority in this case, like I would be happy to be pointed out. And to be very honest, most of the time, I believe that I will be very embarrassed and not outraged if I were being called out, because I think like we have the very strong Singaporean identity. We actually respect all the races,
yeah,
and we really want to make our friends and our neighbors happy. So I think there's this like outrage culture going on right now. You know, like when we talk about rage, people get really upset. So that's my 2 points.
Yeah, and it's a great point, Aigi. Thank you so much. And I think this is a good point to inflect the discussion. You know, on the one hand, we want people to be open-minded, you know, regardless of race. On the other hand, every group wants a representation. I just got an anonymous person in the chat box. His question is this, his or her question, you know, just out of curiosity, why is there no Eurasian representation in discussion? You know, I mean, this is the problem. This is the problem. And you're absolutely right. Why do we put the entire onus on government? You know, we have a problem. You know, we need to always make sure that all the races are represented and so on. At the same time, we say we want to be regardless of race. Let's make up our minds. Well, what is it we want? You know, I think it's perfectly all right if we aspire to have some representation somewhere, and then we have a conversation. But if we want every single group to be represented, my God, we are taking several steps back.
I like to feel that I represent all.
You do, you know.
Apa khabar, ni hao ma.
The different facets of your face, you know.
Yeah, but seriously, seriously, Viswan, I like what Aigi mentioned about don't be over dependent on government, and what also Minister Alvin said just now about the IRCC.
Yeah.
I thought it was a very good example of how we ourselves as people must take the responsibility too. You know, if we can play a part, more of us can be part of that whole process of, you know, the interracial harmony.
Confidence circles.
Circle, which I thought was a very important part. Although Alvin keep mentioning about me being in government, but I saw myself more as part of the community. I served 20 years as editor and actively in a lot of organizations. I felt more with the people, and I feel that's an important part of us wanting to bring about this harmony, this better understanding.
But you see, the thing, Zainal, I'd like to go back to what Aigi said. I could sense her frustration, you know, and I saw Yida nodding as well as she was expressing, because really a lot of my friends who are Chinese, you know, they have the same frustration. If I do this, I'm whacked. If I do that, I'm whacked. And there are all these new terms, you know, microaggression, macroaggression, casual racism, gaslighting, and moonlighting. I don't know, all kinds of things are coming out. You know, it's so difficult. After some time, you're checkmated. You dare not do anything. In the end, the victim is friendships. You know, in friendships, you have to make some mistakes to understand each other over time. But if we are going to be so unforgiving and we start labeling every single thing, it's going to be damn difficult as a society for us to evolve. You know, and I accept that, you know, that we have a problem, you know. So number one, should there even be you know, a directory of names and titles of the types of discrimination in society? Let's move away from that. You know, let's give let's be a little bit more forgiving, a little bit more tolerant of, and not straight away call out. So the question of call out, okay, and several discussions said we need to encourage more calling out. My question is, calling out is not wrong. Calling out is good because it makes people a lot more aware. But what are your thoughts about how do we call out? Do we destroy people? Do we strike them out? Do we cancel them? How do we call out?
Sorry, just before the do we call out, okay, so social media has made it easier for people to give their voice, right? So that's the technology that has enabled people to share. Yeah. Now, if not for calling out on social media, what other options do young Singaporeans have when they face situations? I think if I have answer for that, I can tell you whether we should call out or not on social media.
No, I'm not saying we shouldn't call out. No, I think the general consensus is call out. There's nothing wrong in calling out. Call out. But you don't have to call out with such vehemence and anger and aggression, you know, just let's
But you see, this is where I feel the minority's emotion is like, I'm already, you see, I have not faced racism, but I've lived through the racism that people have told me about. And, you know, at that point of time where sometimes my identity is so reduced, what do you expect us to feel? Calm sound before I go online and says, oh, this has happened to me? I think the expectation has to be a bit reasonable.
No, I agree. So that's why I want to hear your thoughts on you know, how do we call out? You know, because at the end of the day, when you call out, you want some change to happen.
Yes.
But if you're over aggressive, the other party shuts down. They're not going to hear you.
That I agree.
Because anger gets an angry response.
I think Vishwa, we can call out politely and if possible with humor. If we can add some humor into the situation, I think it will diffuse.
I mean, when we were growing up, we had a lot of humor. You know, we called each other all kinds of jokes. You know, so I'd like to.
If I may,
yes.
There's one example which I love. You know, I just had the famous. You know this example, but I'm a big fan and friend of our Young Sikh Association, and we. When I landed on Sunday, we just did one of this kind of dialogue with them. Sean or Sarabjit Singh, whatever you call him, he prefers Sean. But what they did was, when there was a Chinese social media influencer who was, I think, seated in front of a performance, and then there were two Sikh gentlemen in front of her, and she made remarks about the turban blocking them. What the Young Sikh Association did was to invite the social media influencer. I mean, they felt slighted. Sean told me they felt slighted.
Yeah.
Invite the social media influencer to the Gurudwara and then explain the faith to her. And that has been the one example that I've always shared, because it's not that it didn't hurt them. It hurt them. But for them to transcend it and explain the Sikh faith to this person who had slighted them, I think it took a lot, and it inspired, I think, a lot of youngsters. I hope it inspired many others.
Yeah. So I think that's a very interesting thing.
That reminds me of Vishwan about the example of the Sikh. And for example, the Malays. You know, once I remember attending a forum where I was told by other panelists to say that we love you as Malays, but now we're seeing a lot more of Islam, your religion, coming into play, and we begin to worry. partly because of what's happening in the Muslim world, the terrorism, and the narrow interpretation of Islam. But they loved Malays as what they knew, you know. So I think there's a need for better understanding because, like, for example, today early on, when I first came in, somebody commented saying, I wear a batik shirt. Is that because I want to show that I'm Malay? Or does it make me less Singaporean? I was toying whether I should wear a green batik or should wear red because Singapore colors.
Yeah.
Those are symbols, right? Symbolicism. But beyond the symbols, how do we feel about ourselves?
Right.
You know, I believe we are Singaporeans and we understand what it means to be multiracial. And if we can actually inculcate, get this greater sense of understanding among the young, I feel what we have been living all these years, we'll be able to perpetuate and continue with.
Yeah.
So I think there is clearly a need for better understanding, whether it's about the race, about the religion, about the evolving challenges in the world today.
So I would like to, I take your point and my sentiment, and I think quite a few of us, our sentiments are aligned with yours. But I'd like to go back to what Fahima said just now, quite vehemently. You know, she was saying, you know, I'm bombarded with this as a minority person, you know, on so many fronts. It's cumulative. I think the point you're making is cumulative. It's a complete, you know, on so many fronts I'm being hit.
Yeah.
You know, you can't expect that person then to be calm. That point struck me. You know, that point struck me, and I think while we appreciate the larger points that we should all be a lot more conciliatory, we should also accept that, you know, anger can be cumulative and it can be there, right? And it results in microaggression, macroaggression sometimes, like the man who front kicked this lady, right, you know, while she was walking. That's macroaggression. Now I've got a question here. The reason why this is happening, is it because people don't feel that there's some recourse? You know, when things are bottled up, they feel that they can't go somewhere and get recourse, find recourse, right? Now, I can't go to my MP because he's too busy, you know, and he's not the right person. He may not be able to do anything about it. I go to my teacher, she can't do anything about it. You know, who do I go to? And while all this is going on, my frustration mounts. And then at some point, you just snap and you do something else, you know? So the question, and I'd like to, with your permission, extend the discussion by just 15 minutes because I think it's interesting at this point in time. We're talking about recourse. If we can provide some kind of recourse, some kind of outlet, right, where people feel that they will get a fair and clear hearing, I think that will actually solve quite a bit of the problem. Right now, the question is, as Fahima asked, where do I go? Who do I speak to? Am I likely to get a fair hearing? So at this juncture, I'd like to suggest that what is the role of the Presidential Council of Minority Rights? The Presidential Council for Minority Rights is chaired by the Chief Justice traditionally, right? It was set up in 1970, right? And it was set up as a result of the Wee Chong Jin Commission, right? The first Chief Justice, first local Chief Justice of Singapore. And the whole idea is to ensure that legislation is cleared, to ensure that the legislation does not carry anything that is injurious or disadvantageous to minority communities, okay? But it is a passive role, if you ask me, right? But it doesn't mean that they can accept people who have complaints. So my suggestion is it not possible for the remit or the responsibility of the Presidential Council for Minority Rights to be expanded so that people who have grouses, people who feel that there are systemic discrimination or whatever, they can write into the Presidential Council for them to review it, not just limit it to legislation. You know, so that's one possibility. The other possibility is what they have in Germany and in other parts of Europe called the Office of the Ombudsman. You know, we may have heard of this, Office of the Ombudsman. Basically a neutral arbiter with power and authority, right? It is an organ of the state, an autonomous organ of the state, right? And they're resourced. Again, people, and there could be an ombudsman specifically for race. So people feel that this person is neutral. This person has the authority because that person answers straight to Parliament or answers straight to the President or something like that. Now, you can write into the person, the Secretariat clears it, and then the Ombudsman investigates the matter, and the Ombudsman's reports, if they find parties guilty, if they find that something is wrong and is injurious to the interests of minorities, it must be heard and action must be taken. The Parliament is obliged to take action on executive branches. The third possible area for recourse is, we have the community mediation centers, right, which comes to the Ministry of Law. We have them. It runs fairly efficiently, right? Why can't the community mediation centers, for example, act like the small claims tribunal? There could be a part where when you have small conflicts, disputes, you go to the community mediation center and it is settled. In other words, keep the temperature at a certain level. Allow for outlets like this. But what I'm trying to say is that if we do not have some kind of institutionalized support for people who feel lost, who feel that I can't go somewhere and share my grievance and be heard and something can be done, I think you're going to have a lot more people doing flying kicks on the streets. You're going to have a lot more people confronting mixed couples and so on. I don't think they've seen the worst yet. Mm-hmm. This is an opportunity, I think, for us to make amends, to take it seriously. As Zainul said just now, we need to take it seriously. We have an opportunity here to try and change some of the things. Many of the things in our society are going well, but there are some that have been red flagged. Let's not ignore them. Let's not sweep them under the mat. So I'd like the panel to respond.
I can see, Vishwa, where you're coming from, and you're talking about that kind of level of remediation or action lines, which I think we should seriously look into that. But I think we have also very good laws that actually very strict, very serious about how to handle some of these problem areas. But for me personally, I would also like to see in complement to what you have proposed, we should also look at the ground level, at the common people's level, at the IRCC's level, at the churches level, the mosque level, the community organizations level. They should also look into that, where there are members or people from the public who feel aggrieved, who feel they need to turn to someone they can walk, nearby and seek recourse with that. Because what you're proposing will be at the different levels. So you need both, a combination of both.
Yes, great point.
I think the good news is, Vishwa, is that we do not have very much systemic racism in Singapore. That's the way I feel. That if you go to any HDB food court, any one of the HDB shops, anybody can go, anybody can buy and sell. Nobody is going to reject you. Nobody is going to treat you poorly or badly. And that's true of shops and malls and any business. So in general, I don't think that we have deep entrenched systemic racism. And if you want to do business in Singapore, you can't afford to do that. So I think to set up a higher level office might be an admission that our situation is getting bad. But so I would take Zainal's route to find out whether there might be a community-centered opening for people to go to. But let me share a true story. Just a couple of days ago, it might have been yesterday, I was interviewing students for tertiary scholarships. And one of the students happened to be a Muslim girl. And she came from a neighborhood school, but happened to go into RI for JC1 and JC2. So I did ask her how she found integrating into the RI culture when it is a true trained school, but she had to go in. And it was very interesting. She said that in the first year, people would joke around her. Even her friends in her class would joke. They mention her race and her religion and her dress and her food habits, but as a kind of a joke. And she said that I didn't know how to handle it because I was trying hard to integrate myself. So I didn't want to make an issue of it. But come JC2, I think she picked up enough courage to tell her friends, look, this is going too far. It's not a joke to me. So, so I mentioned to her there are counselors in school, there are teachers in school that you could approach, but people face these daily difficulties.
Yeah.
And I think the community approach might be a better approach than a very big hammer to address this.
Well, I believe that you probably need a combination of both, you know, and not necessarily 50-50, but you do need because there are some issues that may have to be looked at a much larger systemic level. But point taken, you know, but there's also the other factor, which is people are currently quite angry, and there's quite a bit of healing that's necessary. I mean, I've spoken to people. I can't quite relate to what they're going through, but they obviously are very badly affected. I'm talking about minority communities, people, right? Individuals. Fahima probably has met quite a few people who are, for whatever reasons, you know, certain incidents in their lives have scarred them. You know, certain ways they've been treated in the public transport system, for example. You know, I can't relate to it directly, but I must respect it. And I think there might be a need for some form of healing as well. You know, and really sometimes, you know, we have to take a page from South Africa, right? The South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and which came immediately after apartheid ended in 1990. You know, and it was very, very effectively done. You know, and of course, the late President Nelson Mandela was the one who was driving it. But as a society, after 55 years, we've been through quite a bit. And demographically, there's one race that is clearly majority. You know, I think there's a time for us to have that reconciliation. And that reconciliation comes about through dialogues like this. It need not be agenda driven, but just allowing people to start talking, you know. So I'd like to end this discussion in the next 5 minutes very quickly to talk about what kinds of conversations can we have in society, and how do we equip people to actually lead these conversations? It's not an easy task. How do we lead them? I mean, Minister talked about IRCCs and so on, you know, but I think the more conversations we have, the higher the likelihood of people, you know, offending each other, because it's fairly new territory.
It's the cold angst and unhappiness relating to another racial group, or is it relating to the policy?
No, to another racial group.
Right. So this whole angst and dissatisfaction is towards another racial group. Is there anything possibly to do with how, you know, they feel that the other group has benefited because of the policies that we have, or, you know, is it really a group centric you know, concern? Because if it's targeted at the group because they feel that they have a certain advantage, you know, then that's a different dynamics, because that involves to a large extent the state and the policies that we have today. Right? And without addressing those policies and, you know, and programs, that is not going to make a lot of change. I think Minister mentioned about having, you know, that potentially in future we may have, you know, minority languages in the SAP school. I think that's a great step, because for the longest time, it's really not so much, you know, why is it that the Chinese have SAP school, but the fact is that, you know, other racial groups don't have something similar. So it's that sense of deprivation that they feel unhappy about, and that kind of feed into how they feel about the other group, you know, in terms of the advantages and the privileges enjoyed.
If I may correct you, Prof, actually the Malays did not feel deprived. There are quarters of Malays who feel deprived because no Malays left school, but the majority of Malay leaders then felt, no, we don't need a SEP school. We wanted Malay students to be proficient in English and Malay as a second language. That's enough.
Yes. And for students to mix together freely and play games and sports, that is the issue. It's not whether other races have SAP schools. That's not the issue at all.
That's why I feel that, you know, there are multiple policy issues that we have to look at. That's one. And then we have to look at how we have conversations at various levels. Like Prasad, you talked about, you know, and Zainul, you talked about temples and, you know, on the ground level. But the truth of the matter is they're not easy. And we must be prepared for some people to take offense as you start opening up and sharing these things. The question is, are we prepared as a society to accept that not everything is going to go smoothly? Let's learn together, let's teach each other, and so on. So on that note, I'd like to, I think we've spoken enough on this. I'd like the Minister to probably, share your final thoughts, perhaps focusing a little bit more on these conversations, both formal and informal conversations that we should have as a society. There are a couple of comments in the chat box, how do we do this? How do we have these conversations? Who is going to lead? Is it going to be top down? Is it going to be MCCY? Or are you going to decentralize it? Are you going to empower other organizations, private sector organizations, and so on? I think there are various ways we can do it, but perhaps we want to hear it from the Minister, and then we should wrap. Over to you, Minister.
Thank you, Vishwa, and thank you to my fellow panelists. As I was thinking about this, the title of this is, you talked about regardless of race. One particular quote came into mind, and it is by the author C.S. Lewis, who said about humility, and I quote, he says, "Humility is not thinking less of yourself, but humility is thinking of yourself less." And if you think about regardless, Vishwa, this is your play on the word, regardless of race and religion. This is about it, right? It's about not thinking of our own interests less. Yeah. That's humility. That's being humble.
Yes, it is.
And that, Minister Shanmugam talked about, the different races being three big balls. One is 75%, one is 18%, one is 7%. If each of these balls think of themselves less, give way a little bit, I think what Mr. Azman mentioned earlier on, where you're a bit scared to talk about this, or I
was confused.
Confused, or you are scared to offend, then I think that will help us to resolve. If every one of us just says, okay, look, we know that there is that common space. I step back a little bit. I step back a little bit. I step back a little bit. I think that would be a society where we are humble. We pride ourselves on humility. But it's not easy. We need to get there. And I think, what Prof. Leong, what Mr. Prasad, Aigi, and others had mentioned earlier on, is that there are these different policies, imperfect as they are, with exceptions and with a lot of different exceptions to the rules which we are tweaking. But these policies help us to get there. But ultimately, I think, Mr. Prasad, you mentioned it, I think you hit the nail on the head, because what Mr. Prasad mentioned was, ultimately, do we want to be in a very litigious kind of society? I spend a lot of time in the US. I don't want my society to be that. But we have a few things that we've done right, a few things that we can tweak a lot more. Next year is the 20th year of IRCC.
Yeah.
And so I'm cracking my brains on how do you make this purpose fit. IRCC was born out of 9/11.
9/11.
Yes. But how do we make it purpose fit so that we recognize the differences, the changes in the tone, the changes in as Fahima mentioned, how social media has supercharged some of these thinking, but also make it purpose fit for 2022 when it's 20 years old. And how do we get there? If I may, I might say that this is, as I mentioned, this is one of many conversations. Tomorrow I have one more. Sunday I have another one in my constituency. The discussions will be less, at a very conceptual level, but will be on the ground. Hey, do you know Chinese do this now? Do you know Indian do that now? But we need to have all of these different layers. We need to have all these different layers to look at history, as Mrs. Zainul mentioned. We need to have different layers between those that are younger and those that are more older, because they have preconceived notions that have been colored by where they lived and where in time they resided. But we need to be able to, even for government to step back a little bit. And that's why I think the best way is for me not to have the last word. But the last word has to go to Fahima, because she represents, but she represents where I really I see Singapore going. That, while this slogan about SG together is just slogans, but we need to act on it, which means that government, yes, we have a lot of these different laws, MHRA, Penal Code, PCMR, the whole thing I can recite to you. But ultimately, we need to have the people, and our people have grown over time, been more responsible, been more open, been more open to different views, but they have to take that lead. So over to you, Fahima, because I think the last word should not be with government.
Okay, good.
Last word should be with you, our youth, and to people who want to make a difference on the ground.
Vishwa, before Fahima takes the last word, I just want to reassure, no more grandfather stories, but the grandfathers are with you all, the millennials.
Thank you.
Firstly,
Okay.
I have joined
Okay,
IRCC.
grandchild, you can start.
So firstly, I've joined IRCC. So I'm vice chairman for UNUSS IRCCs, and we are building a lot of young people to come into IRCC as well. So we are working with the different generations of Singaporeans. Second, talking about it, I started HashP 6 years ago because I felt that civil society had to step up, young people had to step up. So it took me 6 years. We built HashPs, and we've recently looking into launching the care group. I can't solve policy problems and all quickly, but when someone is aggrieved, you need to talk to. I'm not an arbitrator, I'm not a mediator, but I'm a friend. You can come and talk to us. And for our care group, what we've done is we've built in our friends who are in the mental health profession. We're really looking at just, letting it out, vent it, just talk about it, then we are here. That's a solution I can put on the table right now. If you need to talk about it, you're aggrieved, HashP's care group is here. And to be honest, not just HashP's, there's Roses of Peace, Young Sikh Association, Interfaith Youth Circle, I can go on. I think we live in a country where civil society has been given a lot of space to do something about it. Yeah. We do have challenges accessing the people who are really aggrieved. Secondly, I think in terms of there needs to be a sort of a sort of a place where people can take complaints in. I don't know, but I feel maybe one example we can look at is in Australia, they do have the Racial Hatred Act that provides for a commission that does inquire into racial discrimination. But you see, take the good and bad of it. It takes 3.8 months and on average to look into a case. Almost only 55% are really heard and conciliated. And there is the good and bad. But could that model be adopted into something even IRCCs or civil societies can adopt? Where senior people who have seen a lot of these issues, can they become a place to really arbitrate or mediate or conciliate on these issues? I think that's something we can even start looking at quite the immediate. Start working on it. Maybe when we really see the need to come, it can activate. So I think to really close up, I would say these are really the real potential solutions there. We just need to get on towards implementing and following it on through. That's all. Yeah.
Right. So thank you. So really what we're talking about is an all hands on deck approach, right? The higher level, the middle level, plus, what Hash.Peace is doing, and others, talking to individuals. People must feel that they can go somewhere for help, no matter what kind of help they need. And we should not define the problem as binary. The problem is on an entire spectrum. So I believe we have had a good discussion. We can go on for another half an hour, 1 hour, but really I think we have addressed some of the key points here. And I think we have addressed some of the points quite truthfully. So please join me in thanking my panelists, Minister of State Alvin Tan, my abang, Zainal Abidin, Fahima, Associate Professor Leong. Also my NUSS Kawans, Dr. Varaprasad, Azman, Aigi, and Yida. Well, it is clear that from tonight's conversation, as well as the other dialogue sessions, that it can't be business as usual. Something needs to change, and inaction is not an option. The bells have tolled. It should be a clarion call for us to review and rethink policies and how we execute and explain them with honesty and integrity. I would agree with what Zainal said earlier. It's an opportunity for us to deepen our relationships across race and other boundaries. What we are witnessing here, it's a crisis that gives us this opportunity. If we are prepared to acknowledge deficiencies and go beyond platitudes and rhetoric, which sometimes happens, right, in rectifying them, I think if we do it right, we have a very good chance of emerging stronger based on trust. It need not be turned into an alarm bell. That's my biggest concern. What's happening, It doesn't have to be an alarm bell that incites suspicion and distrust, which in turn provokes accusations, attacks, and counterattacks. In this scenario, righteousness gives way to self-righteousness. It's a scary scenario. It is a downward spiral with trust as the victim. Honest conversations don't require a suspension of civility or decency. It doesn't have to be vengeful. We want to give people a chance to realize and reform. After all, it's not like we are under siege. Take, for example, the findings of the 2019 Gallup World Poll. I'm sure some of you have come across this. 95% of respondents in Singapore reported that Singapore is a good place to live for racial and ethnic minorities. The global average was about 70%. Singapore was ranked first worldwide among 24 countries. It is times like this when we have to ask ourselves individually and collectively who we are, what we are made of, and what we stand for. I do believe that we can regard less of race. Let me end with a quote from my favorite leader, the late Nelson Mandela. Minds that seek revenge destroy states, while those that seek reconciliation build nations. Thank you and good night.
Thank you, NUS. Thank you, Vishwa.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Vishwa.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Minister.
Thank you, everyone.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.